Hello and welcome to another episode of the SureTech podcast. And today we're going to be talking about data breaches in general. And what sparked this conversation for us on our end, is the almost 2.7 billion records of personal information for people in the United States were leaked, exposing names, social security numbers, all known physical addresses, and possible aliases, and what that means for all of us. This goes beyond just any business. This goes for everybody's personal lives. So what I want to do is hand it over to Josh. We were just talking about, in our little pre-podcast prep here, we were just talking about how important some of these other pieces of information are nowadays, where everybody says, oh, your social security number being breached, getting stolen is definitely a bad thing. If you apply for a credit card or any sort of credit, you may need to give up some more information because banks and so forth are getting more stringent on the information that they gather to ensure that it is you who is applying for the credit. So Josh, go ahead and take it away. Keep on the train that I started here.
One of the things that gets talked about, so this is the breach we're referring to here is this breach from National Public Data, allegedly from their data. International Threat Actor, US DOD claims that they have these 2.9 billion records that they're trying to sell from people in the US, UK, and Canada. And the big thing on these records, and it's not people, right? I want to be very clear about that. It's not 2.9 billion people, right? Because that's like almost 40% of the global population. Not people, it's records. So a person can have multiple records. And these records are name, mailing addresses, social security numbers, aliases, other names that you may have been known by, which, what's that mean? So, okay, so if you've ever legally changed your name, that's an alias. So that'll show up with other names. If you get married and take your spouse's last name, that's another name, so that that'll show up. And so something that's been talked about for a long time now is this idea that social security numbers are really kind of too vulnerable to be used the way they've been used, where somebody says if you have someone's name, date of birth, and social security number, you basically can impersonate that person, because those are the three pieces of information that get used to verify someone's identity. So you want to get a credit card. They say, what's your name? You say, well, this is my name. This is my date of birth. They say, what's your social security number? You give them the social security number. They check the record with the government, and the record's good. And they say, okay, good. Here's your credit card. No real check beyond that. So something that's changed, and this is not universal. So, listeners, your mileage may vary if you've experienced this or not. I have experienced it. Some financial institutions have taken the view that because the social security numbers have been stolen so much, even before this breach, and are so vulnerable, that they're not going to rely on it solely on that. So they did this expanded, questionnaire. So you would get questions like, where did you live in 2012? What was your address? And you put that in. What was the phone number associated with that address? Like if you had a landline. Have you ever gone by another name? And it's funny because a lot of times it would be like a multiple choice. And they would say like, are any of these you? There'd be, have you ever gone by another name? And there would be like your name and then like some variations of it. And if any of them were you, you'd be like, oh yeah, that's me. And if none of them were you, you'd be like, well, none of those are me. And so it would go through like parsing all this additional information. And it really made it a lot harder to steal someone's identity. So then we get to this breach, and it's not the government didn't get breached, so it's not like the government data, and that there's a whole other thing with like how these people scraped all this data. I'm not gonna get into why they had all these records. They just did. And now they've been breached, almost 3 billion records. And some journalists have gone through some of the sample data that's there. I don't think I want to bought the whole thing, but there's a sample. On the bad side is a lot of this information is accurate. People have looked at it and said, well, yeah, is the correct information. Some of it on the complicated side, some of it's deceased people. So some of those 3 million records refer to people who are no longer living. Theft of identity for deceased people is like a whole rabbit hole to fall down, where the country America particularly doesn't keep really good records of when someone's deceased, and so you can't get credit anymore. You can't get Social Security. The Social Security Administration themselves, if you pull up the data, they admit they're paying people whose date of birth is like 120 years ago. Journalists go, well, are they still alive? Like, we have 120-year-old people running around? Like, let's get some world records going. The security number is like, well, we don't know that they're dead, so we just keep paying. Dead people get their identity stolen. It was shockingly frequently. But,
yeah, constantly.
I mean, they're dead, so I guess they don't really, it doesn't bother them. But it's very tragic for families. On the other good news is some people said the information that's in there is incorrect. So there are errors. Again, I'm not really sure how they built these records. On the one hand, we're talking about there's been this move away from Social Security numbers into this other data, and this is what makes this breach kind of scary. Is a lot of that other data that financial institutions were using, other addresses that you've lived, other numbers you've had, other names you may have gone by, are potentially in this breach. Probably some work. It's not going to necessarily be automated to pull this data out, but it's very concerning for people because that now we've defeated another layer of identity verification. For people listening and people who are like, what do I do? It's really hard for, I think, the average person to take these sorts of breaches seriously because it's like every week there's a new data breach of something. Corporate data, customer data, and you're looking like, well, was I a customer at this company during these years? Is what information stolen? It's constant breaches now, and I think people kind of get breach fatigue, right? You're tired of hearing about it. There's something you can really do about it, and people just don't pay attention. The average listener, I mean, I'm not going to shill for any particular products, but identity protection services are very helpful, particularly ones that will help you in the event that your identity is stolen. So the monitoring, hopefully they catch it when it is stolen. And then also, money to help you with lawyers and the government bureaucracy and police reports. This, you can look around. There's a number of services. So that's something that you can do for peace of mind. The other thing that you can do, and a lot of people are talking about it this week, in light of this most recent breach, is freezing credit, putting fraud alerts on your credit with the credit bureaus, just so that nobody can open a new line of credit. If someone tries to open a new line of credit, it gets denied. If you need to open a new line of credit, you're buying a car, a house, getting a new credit card, a student loan, whatever the case may be, you have to go in, contact the credit bureau and say, hey, it's me. I put the freeze on. I want to unfreeze it. So it makes more hoops to jump through. Because at the end of the day, it's just going to keep happening. But there's been enough breaches, enough large breaches, that I would be shocked if there's anybody in America whose information hasn't been part of one of these breaches. It's appalling how many and how frequent breaches are.
Honestly, Josh, I felt that way for a long time. I see, personally, it's really hard to hold corporations sometimes accountable from a consumer perspective. So, for example, I think it was Target many years, a little over a decade ago, I think, lost everybody's credit card information or something huge like that.
Was that really 10 years ago already?
I know, right? And nothing changed, right? No one stopped shopping at Target. No one stopped shopping at Target online. I personally do not shop at Target really ever. I wasn't affected by said breach, but to your point, what do it's hard for anybody to do anything because it doesn't feel like anybody. I'm not saying that people don't care, but the only way that things will change is if there's actual quote unquote consequences for companies losing people's data. But at this point, as you said, what's the point?
That's where we start to get into the regulatory sphere. The financial industry, very heavily regulated, even on cybersecurity. I mean, they were leading the cybersecurity resiliency back in the early 2000s.
Mm-hmm.
Y2K was a huge thing for financial services to make sure that they weren't going to be affected by it. Mm-hmm. Everybody else everyone says, oh, it wasn't an issue. Right. Because we fixed it. it's good that it wasn't an issue. And then, healthcare, very heavily regulated with, HIPAA and the High Tech Acts. And there's fines, but like no one's personally necessarily being held accountable. So you have, in the example, like the credit card breach, you got to go through, okay, who didn't do what the payment card industry data security standard, PCI DSS, who didn't follow it? Where in the chain did it break down? And then that company gets held responsible. So the company gets held responsible. Whatever happens, I wasn't privy to the inner workings of what Visa and MasterCard did to solve that. But let's say they held some middle payment card processing company liable for the security breach. That company goes away. Okay, the people are going to get other jobs, right? Vendors, companies, they just find another company to work with, and we just move on. Like nobody learned anything. There were no lessons learned. There were no changes, that we can see as the public. That's a very controversial thing when we start talking about personally holding people liable. There was in another regulatory sphere, the CMMC. There was floated this idea that when a company made their attestation of compliance with CMMC, with NIST 171, that senior management, and there was a little vague as to who the senior management was going to be, whether they were talking about boards, a CEO, executive, or if you could push it down to somebody else, but like a person to put their name to it, that they did meet all 110 security controls and they passed the CMMC audit, and that if this was materially false, that person, not the company, that person who signed it was going to be held liable for, I believe it was, they were going to go after them under the False Claims Act, that basically you lied to the government. So there was a breach, and they went in, they said, hey, you said that you had these, approval processes in place before people could make changes, and those weren't followed. And that's what led to, some kind of, security breach. That person was going to be held responsible. The idea behind it was that if your neck is on the line, you're going to run the company the right way. You're going to make sure the rules are followed, the I's are dotted, the T's crossed, and such. And you can kind of see that with the way these breaches, they just keep happening. And the SEC and FINRA and FICA get involved, and there's some personal liability and those regulations as well. Is that until the idea is until people are personally have skin in the game, that there's always going to be people playing fast and loose that are going to pencil whip compliance checklists, not worry about things. A breach happens, you just close shop and change your company name, and it's a whole new ball game. Very controversial, of course, because people, sometimes things just happen, right? With IT, we're all IT professionals. We understand sometimes there's 0 days, things break. Sometimes managers don't have as much control over and how people do things as you would want. And of course, people, may be reluctant to engage in government contracts for CMMC or in, the financial industry. People may just decide that they're going to move on and do other things. So it's very controversial. I think you're going to see an increase in that kind of conversation, that executives are going to start to have their feet held to the fire when these breaches happen.
I personally am of the belief that something should change. At least if the conversation is had, I think it's a good idea to start changing the culture of or around all this stuff. That's what I really think it is. I think it's just culture. We talk about culture on this podcast, and I think that if the culture of the majority is one that lacks caring towards cybersecurity and protecting people's data, I just think that's the world we live in right now. They say that, everybody has a cybersecurity department, but do we actually execute on everything we're supposed to be executing on in the inside of these departments? And then does the rest of the company actually listen to those people? I don't know. But, as you said, sometimes it is a case of everybody doing the right thing and things just happen. But how many times, Josh, in the past 2 years that we've talked about some of these breaches, that it has been just negligence, not having MFA and other things like that,
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. And that's where I think you're going to see some movement in the future where there's going to be this idea of, negligence, like criminal negligence, where privileged accounts don't have MFA, or sensitive personal identifiable information isn't encrypted. I think you're going to see a move, and government's slow, technology's fast, so there's always that gap. But this idea that if you haven't taken certain minimum industry standard, if you will, protections, there's going to start to be like negligence. And that the negligence, of course, is personal. It's not necessarily going to be corporate. But it's a challenge, especially for those listening who aren't, we're just consumers, and or business to business, where you've offset something off to a vendor. You're kind of just trusting them. There's limits to what you can do. And it's all about vigilance and being aware of what information you've given to who. Third party risk management is definitely the wave of the future. I mean, I've been seeing that. That's been like a buzzword for the last 3 years that I've seen really it been in the space, that you need to be aware of what data you've given to what third-party vendors. What access have you given to third-party vendors? What critical core competencies do you rely on third parties for? We just saw, it was big, so I can name names. CrowdStrike here took how many millions of endpoints offline? That's a third-party risk. They provide a wonderful service, security and mobile device management. Like, it's a very critical service that they provide. There was a hiccup, something with the patches. Maybe patches didn't get tested properly, and there was a huge fall. It wasn't a breach. It wasn't data being stolen, but there's this idea: if you're giving people information and then they have a breach, that's third-party risk. The money that you spend on your information security staff, if you have a CISO, Chief Information Security Officer, if you have a risk manager, and the money you're spending on cybersecurity, on tech hardening and configurations. We talk about this a lot. There's a lot of people, businesses that we talk to, business leaders we talk to. It's looked at as an expense, as it's just like an extra. Like, if I'm profitable, I can put a little bit of my profit towards these cyber guys to keep them happy, or to get these compliance people off my back. It's going to change. I don't know how it's going to change. If it's going to be this negligence or personal liability side of things, or if it's going to be another way that businesses need to look at security first. You need to look at security the way you look at having a fire alarm in your building. No one would ever argue you shouldn't have a fire alarm in an office building. Like that would be crazy if somebody said that. Then people just say, like, you're insane. You can't do that. You can't have an office building with no fire alarms. The fire marshal's going to come, they're going to shut you down, they're going to take everybody out, and you're going to get hit with massive fines, and you're going to go to business. Cybersecurity, information security, and the things that we do around protecting data, protecting from these breaches, responding to these breaches, it eventually has to get to that level where you say, in order to be $1 million business, I've got to spend money on security, because that's what allows me to make the money, to keep my business running.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the SureTech Podcast. If you got value out of this episode, please subscribe to our podcast. And for extra credit, please share this podcast with a friend or colleague who may benefit as well. If you have any questions, want to get in touch with us, or want us to discuss a specific topic, please send us an email at info@sure-technologies.com, which is in the description below. Thanks, and we'll see you on the next one.